used to do my watercolor painting process. The very first thing you see me do is lightly sketch out my outlines with my HB pencil, making sure I'm getting the proportions I want and also making sure the subject is positioned well on the paper. I don't really worry too much about the initial sketch because I plan on going over it with a colored pencil later and getting all the finer details then. For this project, I used my red Prismacolor verithin to do the second sketch with. I like that it's a color that blends well with the colors I choose to paint with later, so I don't have to worry about it muddying up my paints. I also really like sketching with these because they're harder than the usual colored pencils you find, so they keep their points longer. Now as I start painting, the very first thing I really like to do is wet the whole paper with just water. This is when a bigger brush would have helped make this part easier, but as you can see, you can do it with a small brush too. Just make sure you work fast so that no part of the paper is starting to dry before you lay down your colors. Now that my paper is wet, I put down my paints on spots, and these will spread well on the page since my paper is wet. I try to use different colors on different spots, like that purple on the bottom with that yellow on top. And of course that bright orange in the middle. Now the colors are something you really want to plan ahead because some colors, when they mix, will get really muddy, especially if they're on the opposite ends of the color wheel. I just make sure that all of the paper is painted on because I don't really want any part of the picture to be left white. This also helps me keep the rest of the subject really saturated and dark to maintain that contrast. Now that that layer is dry, I start working on my second layer. It's basically the same concept as the first one, except this time I'm only gonna be painting on the silhouette of my subject. It's just, again, to separate from the background and make sure it stands out more. Still using the same technique as the first time, which is different colors on different parts of the subject, like that yellow on the nose and the orange on some part of her arms. This time I make sure my paints pool and dry on the edges and really establish a contrast with the background. I'm using the same colors I did on the background, except this time I added a bit more green on the shadows to throw it off a little. I chose green because the whole thing was starting to look a little red to me, so green being its complementary color, I went with that to make sure the edges look dark and less saturated than the rest. Adding that contrast color really helped to establish the shadows early on, even when it's only technically my first layer. I also keep an eye on where that color is going because I don't want that to go over to the parts that I want to keep light. If it does do that, you can use a wet wipe or a cotton ball to lift it off of the page as long as it's still wet, and you can see me do that here. The third layer is when you want to use your dark colors. Try to add more blues and greens in there without using black at first. I find that this keeps the palette vibrant but also very saturated. This is when I only start painting on the shadowed parts and leave out the parts where the light is hitting. Again, on this one, I like to offset the shadows by adding a bright color towards the edges because I'm still really building up the whole picture and not just drawing on the shadows. I do this by taking my brush and dipping it into my watercolors without getting it wet first so the color stays vibrant. I then tap that onto the edges of the shadows and let the water do its job and spread it to the rest of the painting. This next layer I use to establish the dark parts of the shadows from the lighter parts of the shadows, so really I'd only be painting on the parts I've already painted on for the previous layer. With this one, I ended it with using a really bright yellow to make the lighter parts more interesting. And because I have so many dark layers underneath that, I had to use this yellow like I would use gouache. So I didn't use a lot of water on it, and just to make sure it shows up on top of such dark colors underneath. With inking, I ended up using multiple brush pens to achieve those thin lines for the details and sharp bold lines I used to make the whole piece more graphic. This is why I like to use this brand of colors, because even after all those layers I put on the paper, I could still see my initial sketch peeking through underneath, and that helps me when I'm inking. Now, a lot of people actually don't want their sketch to show up underneath, so if you're one of those people, just make sure you really clean up your line work before you start painting. this painting, you actually see me mess up a lot. I like to leave it there just to show people that very rarely do my paintings ever work out perfectly, like how I imagined they would when I start. One way I fix my mistakes is to use my Posca pens, and there are these really opaque markers from Japan that I use to add highlights and even cover up some of my paintings. On this one, I realized I don't actually like the silhouette of my subject, and I wanted to clean that up. So I used my Posca pens to essentially erase some of the parts, so it's making the outline that I want it to look like. I then use my colored pencils to add some kind of color to those areas so I don't just leave them white. I also use my colored pencils to just add some interesting colors to the painting. The freckles I added in there because they're what really drew me to the photo in the first place. I used a bunch of different colors for them, some purples, some dark reds, and even some oranges, because I don't just like to dot them in there with my black ink. They didn't show up that well in the video, but they're there. And they added that extra something that the whole painting needed, I think. This part, I freehanded the lace, and I kind of regret it because I wish I had planned it more before I did it. But it did turn out okay, I think. And then you just see me go back and forth with the Posca pen and colored pencils technique as I go along inking and correcting. My art supplies will be listed on the description, and if you have any questions or suggestions for future videos, just leave a comment and I'll make sure I'll answer them. Thanks for watching.